Saturday night, a single post appeared on a prominent social media platform that instantly sent shockwaves through global energy markets, defense headquarters, and capitals across the Middle East. In bold, emphatic language, the message declared that unless Iran immediately and unconditionally reopened the Strait of Hormuz to all shipping, without any further intimidation or interference, the United States would launch devastating strikes against Iranian power generation facilities, beginning with the single largest installation and proceeding from there. The window given was precise, 48 hours from the moment of posting. As the clock began ticking, that deadline pointed toward a specific hour on Monday evening Eastern Time, leaving the world watching every passing minute with growing unease. Within a remarkably short time, Iranian authorities fired back through official channels. A statement from military leadership, broadcast via state outlets, made clear their position. Any assault on Iran's energy infrastructure would trigger immediate and proportional retaliation, targeting American and allied energy assets throughout the region. The response singled out critical vulnerabilities: pipelines carrying vital hydrocarbons, information technology networks essential to operations, and large-scale desalination plants that supply fresh water to populations across the Gulf littoral. The warning carried an unmistakable symmetry: interfere with what sustains our society, and we will strike what sustains yours. Two stark declarations now hung in the air, separated by mere hours, framing what many analysts quickly recognized as the most perilous phase yet in a conflict already stretching into its third week. This confrontation stands apart from earlier exchanges, missile barrages, naval skirmishes, drone incursions, because it directly threatens the sinews of modern civilian life rather than purely military targets. The Strait of Hormuz remains the artery through which roughly one-fifth of the planet's traded oil flows each day. Its partial or full closure has already driven benchmark crude prices surging past $110 a barrel, rattling economies from Tokyo to Frankfurt. Yet the current standoff escalates far beyond shipping lanes. It pivots on electricity grids and water supplies, elements so fundamental that their disruption could cascade into humanitarian crises, affecting tens of millions in a matter of days. The language employed on both sides, obliterate on one hand, every pipeline burns on the other, signals not mere posturing, but a calculated willingness to cross lines previously held sacred even in wartime. To grasp the gravity, consider the architecture of Iran's power system. The country maintains well over 100 major natural gas-fired facilities, supplemented by hydroelectric dams, solar arrays, wind farms, oil and diesel-based generators, coal units, geothermal sites, and a single operational nuclear reactor. Despite prolonged international sanctions, engineers have built a tightly integrated national grid capable of delivering reliable supply across a vast territory. The crown jewel of this network is widely regarded as the massive combined cycle installation, situated roughly 70 kilometers southeast of the capital, boasting an installed capacity approaching 2,900 megawatts, sufficient to power several million households, and a substantial share of industrial activity in the metropolitan area. Nearby provinces host other significant stations, including a large northern complex along the Caspian coast, rated at over 2,200 megawatts, and additional facilities northeast of the capital, exceeding 2,000 megawatts in aggregate output. For perspective, even the United States' biggest natural gas plants rarely exceed 3,750 megawatts, yet Iran's leading unit serves a population more than double that of many American states, while operating under far greater resource constraints. The deliberate ambiguity in naming the primary target amplifies the psychological pressure. It could refer to the Tehran area giant, or perhaps the coastal nuclear facility, already damaged in prior strikes, that generates around 1,000 megawatts, but carries profound symbolic weight due to its technology and location. Either choice would inflict severe damage, but the promise to begin with the biggest one first leaves planners guessing and populations anxious. Such vagueness is no accident. It forces constant worst-case preparations while keeping diplomatic off-ramps theoretically open. Yet the intent behind the verb chosen leaves little room for misinterpretation. This is not about temporary outages or surgical degradation, but about erasing key nodes from the map entirely. The prospect of targeted strikes on such facilities carries consequences that ripple far beyond the immediate blackout zones. A single combined cycle plant of that scale, once removed from service through precision munitions or sustained bombardment, would deprive the national grid of roughly 3 to 4% of total installed capacity overnight. In practice, the loss would feel much larger. These large stations often anchor regional load centers, feeding directly into high-demand urban and industrial corridors. Backup generation exists: older oil-fired units, smaller gas turbines, distributed renewables, but much of it operates near limits already, strained by years of maintenance shortfalls and fuel supply bottlenecks. Engineers would scramble to reroute power flows, but cascading failures become probable when the backbone nodes vanish. Rolling blackouts that currently last a few hours could stretch into days or weeks, plunging hospitals, water pumping stations, food refrigeration chains, and communication hubs into darkness. For a population of 87 million accustomed to relatively stable electricity despite sanctions, the psychological shock would compound the physical hardship. Iranian officials understand this calculus intimately. Their counter-threat, while broad, was not random. The list of potential retaliation targets: offshore oil platforms, onshore refineries, cross-border pipelines, submarine cable landing points, satellite ground stations, and especially the cluster of massive desalination facilities along the southern coast, represents mirror image vulnerabilities on the other side of the Gulf. Several Gulf Arab states rely on desalination for up to 90% of municipal water supply. A coordinated strike on those plants, even if limited to control rooms or intake structures rather than outright destruction, could force emergency rationing within 72 hours. Crude export terminals already operating under heightened alert would face renewed drone and missile risks, potentially halting loadings for extended periods. Global energy traders, still digesting the initial post, watched futures contracts leap another 8% in after-hours trading as the tit-for-tat language crystallized. What makes this moment feel qualitatively different from previous escalations is the explicit linkage between military action and civilian life support systems. Earlier phases of the conflict featured exchanges confined largely to air defense networks, proxy militias, and naval assets in international waters. Those incidents, while deadly, allowed both sides to maintain a degree of plausible deniability about intent and to calibrate responses below the threshold of total war. The current declarations dispense with such ambiguity. One side has announced a 48-hour clock tied to a choke point commodity flow. The other has responded by promising symmetric damage to the infrastructure that keeps modern cities habitable. Neither statement includes qualifiers about proportionality, collateral limits, or diplomatic preconditions for de-escalation. The rhetoric has hardened into operational planning language. Behind closed doors, military staffs on multiple continents are running the same grim simulations. Strike planners map radar coverage gaps, missile defense envelopes, and dispersal patterns for Iran's mobile air defense batteries. They weigh the political cost of hitting a nuclear site against the strategic benefit of removing a symbolically potent generator from the board. On the Iranian side, Commanders review dispersal of fast attack craft, readiness of shore-based anti-ship batteries, and cyber intrusion packages designed to degrade SCADA systems at key export facilities. Intelligence agencies monitor troop movements, fuel convoys, and unusual radio traffic, searching for any sign that either party is posturing versus preparing to act. Satellite imagery analysts pore over thermal signatures at major plants, noting which stacks remain hot and which appear idled, small clues that could indicate preemptive shutdowns or evacuation orders. Publicly, the tone remains defiant on both ends. State television in Tehran replayed archival footage of past military parades, alongside graphics showing the reach of ballistic missiles capable of covering the entire Gulf in minutes. In Washington, briefers emphasized readiness while avoiding specifics, a studied restraint that nonetheless conveyed unmistakable resolve. Neutral observers, diplomats in Geneva, energy ministers in Vienna, risk analysts in Singapore, struggled to identify any off-ramp still visible. The strait remained open for now, with commercial traffic transiting under escort, yet tanker charter rates had already doubled in anticipation of sudden closure. Insurance underwriters attached war risk premiums that made many voyages uneconomic. Every hour that passed without retraction or clarification tightened the coil further. As Sunday morning broke across time zones, the deadline stood at roughly 36 hours remaining. Markets opened lower in Asia despite weekend gains in oil. Equity indices in Europe and the Americas braced for another volatile session. Civilians in coastal cities from Bandar Abbas to Dubai checked emergency supply lists, generator fuel, bottled water, battery banks, while governments issued cautious travel advisories. The world had entered a phase where abstract geopolitical tension had condensed into a concrete, time-bound ultimatum, and the machinery of escalation appeared to be turning under its own momentum. By midday Sunday, the atmosphere had thickened into something almost palpable. Diplomatic back channels, usually discreet, now leaked fragments of frantic exchanges, urgent appeals from European capitals for restraint, quiet assurances from Beijing that it would not tolerate prolonged disruption to global supply chains, and guarded silence from Moscow that many interpreted as tacit approval of escalation if it served to fracture Western cohesion. Yet none of these interventions appeared to slow the momentum. The original 48-hour window had shrunk to under 34 hours, and every public statement from either side reinforced rather than softened the positions staked out the night before. Iranian state media shifted tone slightly, moving from broad warnings to granular demonstrations of capability. Broadcasts featured computer-generated simulations of missile salvos arcing across the Gulf, overlaid with maps highlighting clusters of desalination towers, LNG export terminals, and the sprawling pipeline networks that thread through the peninsula. Commentators emphasized redundancy in Iranian systems, how distributed solar farms in the east and hydroelectric reservoirs in the Zagros could cushion urban blackouts, while portraying Gulf neighbors as dangerously over-reliant on single-point infrastructure. The subtext was clear. We have learned to live with scarcity. You have not. At the same time, air defense batteries around key power plants were visibly repositioned on live feeds, mobile launchers rolled into forested cover, and civilian evacuation notices appeared in districts adjacent to major facilities. These moves, while defensive in nature, also served as a public signal of seriousness. Across the water, Allied naval forces tightened their posture. Carrier strike groups maneuvered to maintain optimal launch windows for standoff weapons, while submarine assets slipped closer to contested waters. Public briefings stressed precision and proportionality, yet the vocabulary betrayed deeper calculations. Phrases like degraded capacity and long-term strategic effects, hinted at ambitions well beyond temporary outages. Satellite reconnaissance showed increased activity at forward air bases, fuel trucks queuing, ordnance carts moving under camouflage netting, patterns consistent with final pre-strike preparations rather than routine exercises. In Washington and allied capitals, emergency cabinets convened in secure rooms, weighing the domestic political cost of action against the international cost of inaction. Polling data already showed sharp partisan divides, with one camp demanding swift enforcement of the ultimatum, and the other warning of an energy shock that could tip fragile economies into recession. Energy traders, meanwhile, operated in a state of controlled panic. Brent crude touched $118 before profit-taking pulled it back slightly. Natural gas contracts in Europe spiked 14% as traders priced in the possibility of diverted LNG cargoes. Refineries along the Gulf Coast ran at reduced throughput, conserving feedstock in anticipation of supply interruptions. Shipping firms rerouted vessels away from the strait whenever possible, accepting longer voyages around the Cape despite added bunker costs. War risk insurance clauses activated automatically at midnight, doubling or tripling premiums and rendering many tanker charters temporarily unviable. The financial contagion spread quickly. Airline stocks slid on fears of sustained high fuel prices, while defense contractors saw modest gains as markets bet on prolonged tension. Inside Iran, the mood oscillated between resolve and quiet apprehension. In Tehran, long lines formed at petrol stations as drivers topped up tanks against the prospect of disrupted refining capacity. Pharmacies reported brisk sales of backup power banks and LED lanterns. Social media carried a mix of defiant memes, images of burning tankers captioned with Persian proverbs about enduring hardship, and more somber posts from families in vulnerable coastal provinces preparing go bags. Government spokespeople maintained that national unity had never been stronger, pointing to volunteer civil defense drills and blood donation drives as evidence of societal resilience. Yet private conversations, captured in scattered overseas reporting, revealed growing unease among ordinary citizens who remembered the grinding blackouts of the early sanction years and dreaded a return to that reality on a far larger scale. As the afternoon wore on, independent analysts began publishing worst-case scenarios that lent the deadline an even sharper edge. One widely circulated assessment estimated that simultaneous strikes on the three largest gas-fired plants could remove up to 12% of national generation capacity within hours, triggering immediate load-shedding protocols that would darken entire provinces. Another modeled the cascading effects of retaliatory strikes. Loss of two major desalination complexes could force emergency water trucking to cities of over 1 million people each, while damage to a single cross-Gulf pipeline might cut 800,000 barrels per day of export volume indefinitely. The numbers painted a picture not of manageable disruption, but of systemic fragility. Grids pushed to collapse, water systems rationed by the leader, food supply chains interrupted at refrigeration bottlenecks. Humanitarian organizations quietly activated contingency plans, pre-positioning aid stockpiles in neighboring countries while praying the threshold would not be crossed. With roughly 28 hours now remaining, the question no longer centered on whether either side possessed the means to act. Both clearly did. But on whether political will, domestic pressure, or last-minute diplomacy could still intervene before the first weapon left its launcher. The machinery of modern war had been wound tight. The only variable left was the human decision to release it. As the final hours dwindled, fewer than 24 remaining on the ultimatum clock, the tension reached a pitch that silenced even the most seasoned observers. Markets had largely frozen in place, trading volumes thinned to skeletal levels as participants held positions rather than risk new exposure. Brent crude hovered just shy of $122, a level unseen since the earliest days of major Gulf disruptions, while equity indices across Asia, Europe, and North America drifted sideways in a state of uneasy suspension. The absence of fresh statements from either principal actor only deepened the unease. Silence in this context felt louder than any new declaration. Every minute without retraction or clarification read as incremental confirmation that the machinery was locked in and moving forward. In Tehran, the streets carried an almost surreal calm, punctuated by bursts of activity. Civil defense sirens tested sporadically throughout the afternoon, their wails drifting over rooftops as volunteers in high visibility vests directed traffic away from sensitive zones. Power company crews worked in plain view at substation perimeters, stringing additional cabling and positioning mobile generators, preparatory measures framed officially as routine resilience drills, but clearly timed to the deadline. Residential neighborhoods saw an uptick in people filling bathtubs and jerry cans, a quiet ritual of self-preservation that needed no official prompting. State television alternated between footage of military readiness, columns of launchers repositioned under twilight skies, and interviews with ordinary citizens who spoke with measured defiance about enduring whatever came next. The narrative being shaped was one of national endurance rather than panic, yet the visible preparations told their own story. On the opposite shore of the Gulf, Allied military postures had hardened into near operational tempo. Flight decks buzzed with final weapons loads. Refueling aircraft traced wide racetrack patterns in the sky, ready to extend the reach of strike packages. Electronic warfare suites swept the spectrum continuously, mapping every radar pulse and communication burst emanating from Iranian territory. Public affairs officers maintained a tight lid on specifics, releasing only carefully worded updates about maintained readiness and defensive posture. But the tempo of movements visible on open-source satellite feeds left little doubt. Assets were arrayed for rapid sequenced execution if the order came. In parallel, diplomatic efforts intensified behind the scenes. Secure lines carried last-ditch messages from third-party mediators, proposals for sequenced de-escalation, mutual stand-downs tied to verifiable actions in the Strait. Yet each overture met the same stony response. The clock was non-negotiable, unless the waterway was cleared unconditionally first. The technical dimensions of what might unfold next had by now been dissected exhaustively in think tank briefings and leaked assessments. A strike package targeting the primary combined cycle facility would likely involve multiple waves. Initial suppression of air defenses using standoff cruise missiles and electronic attack, followed by penetrating bombers or drones delivering heavy precision-guided munitions against turbine halls, control buildings, and fuel supply infrastructure. The goal would not be complete physical annihilation. Modern plants are sprawling and hardened, but functional erasure, rendering the site inoperable for months or years through destruction of irreplaceable components like high-pressure boilers and generator rotors. Secondary targets could follow in quick succession if resistance persisted, each escalation calibrated to inflict maximum grid stress with minimum civilian footprint. Iranian planners, anticipating exactly this sequence, had reportedly dispersed critical spares, buried backup command nodes, and pre-positioned rapid repair teams. Whether those measures would prove sufficient against sustained, high-tempo operations remained the great unknown. Retaliation modeling painted an equally grim picture. Iranian missile forces maintained a deep inventory of precision-guided ballistic and cruise weapons capable of saturating Gulf targets within minutes of launch. Simulations showed coordinated barrages overwhelming point defenses at key export terminals and desalination clusters, even if layered Patriot and THAAD batteries absorbed a significant fraction of incoming rounds. Cyber elements would almost certainly activate in parallel. Intrusion attempts against industrial control systems, denial of service floods against emergency response networks, amplifying physical damage through chaos and delayed recovery. The combined effect could halt a third or more of regional hydrocarbon exports for weeks, drive spot LNG prices into stratospheric territory, and force water rationing protocols across multiple capitals. Global supply chains, already fragile, would fracture further. Chemical plants dependent on Gulf feedstocks would idle. Shipping routes would reroute at ruinous cost, and consumer prices for everything from gasoline to plastics would spike in cascading waves. With less than 12 hours now visible on public countdown graphics shared across social platforms, the psychological weight settled heaviest on those living closest to the fault lines. Families in Bandar Abbas and Bushehr kept radios tuned to state frequencies. Residents of Abu Dhabi and Manama checked civil defense apps obsessively. In Washington, the night shift in situation rooms tracked every telemetry blip, every intercepted fragment of chatter. Diplomats in neutral venues made one final round of calls, voices low and urgent, searching for any crack in the impasse. Yet the fundamental equation remained unchanged. One side had drawn a bright red line around a global choke point and civilian power supply. The other had answered by drawing a matching line around its adversary's equivalent lifelines. Neither had blinked. As the eastern sky began to lighten toward what could be the final dawn before the deadline, the world held its breath. The strait still carried traffic, tankers moving deliberately under warship escort, but the volume had thinned to a trickle. Every radar contact, every radio exchange, every social media post from the region was scrutinized in real time for the slightest indication of movement toward or away from the precipice. The hourglass had nearly emptied. What happened next would depend on a handful of decisions made in windowless rooms by men and women who understood that the consequences, once unleashed, would reshape energy security, regional stability, and the global economy for years to come. The story had reached its knife-edge moment, and history waited only for the first spark to determine whether it would end in de-escalation or catastrophe.